Good morning and welcome to our third class on lessons from the rivers of the Bible. Today's lesson is taken from Genesis 32 verses 22 through 32 and is entitled Wrestling with God. And I must admit that I've struggled with this lesson many times over the years because this wrestling match just seems so peculiar. Last week Randall talked about Jacob fleeing from his father-in-law Laban to return to the land of Canaan. He had spent the past 20 years living in Haran as a shepherd for Laban. Haran was a city in northern Mesopotamia where Jacob's grandfather and great-grandfather had settled after leaving Ur of the Chaldees. You may remember that Laban got caught up with Jacob and his family in the mountains of Gilead. When the dust settled from this encounter, Laban and Jacob made a covenant in Ramoth Gilead. Afterwards, Jacob and his caravan continued south and camped at Machanil, which literally means two camps, and was so named by the patriarch. Here Jacob was met by two angels of God. And from there Jacob sent messengers to his brother Esau, who is settled in Edom at the southern end of the Dead Sea. When his messengers return, he learns that his brother is coming to meet him with 400 men. Jacob is now afraid and divides his people and flocks into two companies. And his logic was that if Esau attacked one of the companies, the other company could escape. You'll recall that Jacob originally fled the land of Canaan because Esau planned to kill him. The first part of Genesis 32 tells how Jacob planned to send presents of a total of 550 animals in more than 3 different waves, trying to appease his brother before they met face to face. And our lesson today takes place in and around the Jabbok River. So I'm going to show you its location on a map before we read the text. This river begins near modern Amman, Jordan. It flows north and then west into the Jordan River at a point 20 miles north of the Dead Sea. And so with this geographical orientation, let's read our text for this lesson, Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32. And he arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of the Jabbok. He took them, sent them over the brook, and sent over what he had. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. And when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip. And the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" He said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked, saying, "Tell me your name, I pray." And he said, "Why is it that you ask me about my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, where I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Just as he crossed over Penuel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. Therefore to this day the children of Israel do not eat the muscle that shrank, which is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip in the muscle that shrank. Well, having sent servants on ahead with the presents for Esau, Jacob is left with his household and remaining assets on the north side of the Jabbok River at Machanil. And with no reason given, Jacob arose during the night and crossed over the Jabbok River with household and possessions. And even though they crossed at the ford of this river crossings at night were still risky operations. While the text enumerates Jacob's 2 wives, 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, there were undoubtedly more in this group, including his daughter Dinah. Once Jacob had these safely across on the southern shore of the Jabbok, he crossed back over to the northern side. Now, all alone, Jacob is now confronted by a man who wrestles with him until daybreak. Immediately, readers want to know who this man is. If we know Jacob's past, we remember another night when he was alone in Bethel as he began his flight to Haran 2 decades ago. That night he dreamed of a ladder reaching to heaven and angels ascending and descending on it. He concluded that the Lord was there, so he named it Bethel, or House of God, although it was formerly known as Luz. I remind you of this because he will make a similar inference after his wrestling match. But before we jump to any conclusions, let's consider what the text says. First, the man was not able to prevail against Jacob or pin him down. This is a clear indication that this was not God himself. Most likely, this man was a messenger or angel from God. We've seen such men before, as in Genesis 18, when 3 men visited Abraham, and we'll see them again as the commander of the Lord's army in Joshua 5, verses 13 through 15, or as an angel announcing the birth of Samson in Judges chapter 13. But the best identification of the man wrestling with Jacob is given in Hosea 12, verses 2 through 4, which reads, "The Lord also brings a charge against Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways. According to his deeds he will recompense him. He took his brother by the heel and the womb, and in his strength he struggled with God. Yes, he struggled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought favor from him. He found him in Bethel, and there he spoke to us." Undoubtedly, Jacob has been wrestling with one of God's angels in the form of a man. However, when he saw that he was not going to prevail against Jacob, the angel touched, or more probably struck him in his hip socket, knocking it out of joint. But Jacob hung on, and the man requested Jacob to let him go because the sun was coming up. And Jacob now reveals that he knows this is no ordinary man as he responds, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." It's interesting to consider that Jacob began life wrestling his twin in the womb, and later stole the older twin's blessing. And now he's wrestled one of God's angels, but won't let him go without a blessing. The second thing we want to consider is the name change for Jacob. You may remember how Jacob received his name. It's found in Genesis 25 and verse 26. After his brother came out and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore him. Jacob's name means heel grabber or supplanter. We might just call him a heel today. As if the angel didn't know his name, he asked the man with the dislocated hip, "What is your name?" He replied to the angel, "Jacob." While scholars continue to argue the meaning of Israel, perhaps it's best to take the meaning from the text, which identifies the name with the Hebrew Sarah, to struggle, found only here and in Hosea 12 and verse 3. Now notice verse 28 of our text. "And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." You know, names are important and serve as our identity. In this case, the promised descendants of Abraham will be named not after him, but after his grandson. They will be known as the Israelites, or the nation of Israel, even to this day. The wrestling match seems to have been a test for Jacob and his tenacity. And its location at the Jabbok River is probably not coincidental, since this river will serve as a frontier of Israel in the future. It will be the northern boundary of the Israelites' first victory east of the Jordan before entering the Promised Land as they defeat the Amorite king Sihon. Since Jacob or Israel prevailed, we come to the third thing to notice about the text, the blessing. But first, Jacob asked the man or the angel his name. You know, some angels are known by name in Scripture, but this one rhetorically asked why Jacob wants to know. And then he blessed him there. And it's tempting to go over to Genesis 35, verses 9 through 12, and see this as the blessing. However, it appears that this is a theophany that occurred a little later at Bethel and completed the circle of Jacob's journey begun some 20 years before. Therefore, we don't know how the angel blessed Jacob at the end of the wrestling match. This brings us to the fourth thing we want to glean from the text. That is the naming of the place where Jacob wrestled with the angel. Let's read verses 30 and 31 of our text again. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, where I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Just as he crossed over Peniel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. And using the Hebrew word for face, paneh, Jacob names the place where he wrestled the angel as Peniel, used only this one time. The other 6 times it appears in Scripture, it will be as Penuel. Same meaning, just a different spelling. Jacob even explains the name as having seen God face to face, and his life was preserved. But you and I know he didn't see God face to face, but rather the face of one of his messengers. John 1 and verse 18 affirms this truth about not seeing God. The sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, or as he crossed over the Jabbok at that location. Either meaning is possible, but either way he was limping because of his dislocated hip. And although there is no further scriptural dietary prohibition, the author notes that the children of Israel do not eat the muscle or tendon attached to the hip joint to that day. This ban is mentioned in rabbinic writings and is associated with the sciatic nerve. While we have noticed 4 things about Jacob's wrestling encounter with the angel, I want to stress 2 things resulting from the encounter. The first is that Jacob received a new name, Israel. While he will still usually be referred to as Jacob, the descendants of the patriarchs will bear his new name as Israelites. And if we continue through the text into chapter 33 and read of Jacob's reunion with Esau, we would have expected him to continue south to Edom with his brother. However, Jacob the heel reneges on his promise to his brother and builds a house at Succoth. Later he will cross over the Jordan with his household and settle at Shechem, but that's a story for another day. Before we leave the Jabbok River, we need to remember that Jacob is returning from Padan Aram at the Lord's direction. And we need to place this event in Jacob's life within the bigger story of the promise made to Abraham. To do this, I want to read Jacob's prayer at Machanil, shortly before he escorted his household across the river. I'm reading from Genesis 32, verses 9 through 12, just prior to Jacob preparing the presents to be sent ahead to soften Esau's attitude. Then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your family, and I will deal well with you. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become 2 companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. For I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mother with the children. For you said, I will surely treat you well, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Perhaps there was more to this prayer that was not recorded, but Jacob is pleading for deliverance from Esau. Once again, he must trust in the Lord to deliver him. And the wrestling match later that evening seems to have been the confidence booster he needed. Like Jacob, sometimes it's difficult for us to continue standing on the promises, and we wrestle with God. Hope you have a great week. Thank you.